Yeah. And just a reminder, these meetings are open to the public. If you are a task force committee member, we ask you to be on video. If you're in a safe place to do so, please don't do so if you're driving. If you're a member of the public, we do ask you to turn your video off now, simply so we can focus on the committee members during some conversations. But we appreciate everybody joining, whether you're a committee member, member of the public, just somebody interested in hearing what's going on with this task force. We are going to move pretty quickly into the content and substance. We appreciate everybody's time. As you all know, a couple of the working groups have begun meeting. We've had the Student Success Group and the Workforce Alignment Group each meet a couple of times. And at their first meeting, the conversation really was about what is the current dynamic. And the Student Success Group was really looking at what do we need to do to make sure students are successful. And we talked about success in two ways. Both success in their academic pursuits, but also success in what those academic pursuits lead to in the workforce. Are we preparing students to be successful in their education and with that education as they go forward? And these groups, that group in particular, was very intentional to define students pretty broadly. We want to make sure we don't get in that trap of talking just about that 19-year-old or 18-year-old just out of high school, that we're talking equally about the 30-year-old going back to school to get a two-year degree, or the 45-year-old who is downsized and is reskilling, or somebody continuing their career path and wanting to enhance their academic credentials and their education to adapt to the changing workforce. And that led to the conversations around the second work group, the group around workforce alignment, where we've had some really robust conversations about whether we were meeting all of the needs we could be as an education ecosystem in post-secondary education to make sure that employers can find employees who have both the technical skills and the soft skills to meet the needs of today and 10 years from now, and that any employer, whether they're a startup, a small business, or an international conglomerate, can always count on finding the highly trained workforce here today and can know there's a post-secondary system that will train those employees for the future. From there, after these initial conversations, each of those groups was asked to submit a number of recommendations, specific actionable ideas that we could use. Some of them using some of the federal dollars we have, which total a little over $95 million. And those ideas range from everything from stackable credentials to regional collaboratives, open access to data for students to be able to track their learning and their academic progress, to additional supports for students. We're going to bring all of that to this group, but that's where those first two groups have been, and then we'll tag in the third group, the aligned systems, when these two groups wrap up with their third meeting. And that aligned system group will take a look at all those recommendations and say, based on these, what does our ecosystem need to look like? And all those ideas then surface to you guys as the task force committee to take a look at what recommendations we want to put forward. But with that, I'm going to ask Sarah if she wants to add anything, and then I'll ask Brian to key us up for the agenda for the rest of the meeting.
No, Barrick, but just to capture very quickly what the point of today is. The goal of today is to hear back from both subcommittees, and we have two guests from both, one from each subcommittee to report out and to answer any questions you all may have. Number two, it's to catch you up more specifically on the details of the next steps. Although, as Barrick mentioned, people have submitted their recommendations, we're not going to review the actual recommendations today. That's going to be forthcoming, and you'll be getting those tomorrow. But we're going to set the stage for all that and set the stage for the conversation. So with that, I'm going to turn it back to Brian, and just want to welcome everyone and thank everyone for being here.
Thank you, Sarah and Barrick. Welcome, everyone. I'm glad to have us all here today for our first formal task force meeting and our chance to really catch up on some of the important work that our working groups have been doing. So I'm going to just roll this down a little bit here. Remind you the meeting is being recorded. Barrick was kind enough to remind everyone, please stay on camera if you're a member of the task force. I really do love to see the body language and see the emphasis and share in those reactions, those nonverbals if we can here today. And also remember, as we think about the live conversation, we're really focusing that on our task force members. But we welcome everyone here to understand and how we're moving ahead and what we're sharing. So first up, as I finish this moment here, we're going to ask Dr. DeSantis to give us a quick recap of our student success working groups. What are some of the takeaways from that? What are some of the discussions and the progress that's been made? And then we'll switch to Helen Hayes for our workforce development group, get a little bit more information there. And then we want to make sure everybody has a chance for some Q&A. So we'll give you some time for that. And then as Sarah mentioned, we're going to make sure we have enough time here to really review our recommendation process. What are the tools we're going to use? What are some of those expectations we'll have of each of you to contribute and share your thoughts on each of the ideas that have been that have come through. And again, we'll be sharing with you tomorrow. So make sure you have enough time to really think about these, put some emphasis on some of them, and give us your feedback. So that's coming here today. And then we want to make sure we have plenty of time here at the end for Q&A and just open discussion with this group. You're such a broad group of experience and so much to contribute in the process that we think that open dialogue is really our best way to share with you. So with that, I'll ask Dr.
Landon, with that agenda, there's still hope we're out early. Come on now. Anyway, I'm just teasing. Keep going.
That's perfect. I'd like to ask Dr. DeSantis, please, if you don't mind, I'll give you the screen here and the voice. So turn it over to you. Thank you.
All right, sounds great. Thank you, Brian, and thank you, Barrick and Sarah. It is truly my honor to have been asked to join the task force today to share the recommendations as a representative of the Student Success Working Group. As Brian said, my name is Dr. Maria Elena DeSantis. For those that is way too much of a mouthful, Marie is just fine. And I serve as the president of the Community College of Denver. The Student Success Working Group, as already mentioned, has completed 2 meetings and submitted our recommendations for review and discussion. During the first meeting, the Student Success members discussed the challenges that students face in today's current landscape and the desired end state or student outcomes that we most desire for all of Colorado's learners. Again, to the point that we're not just focusing on that 18, 19-year-old, but learners across the board. We really grappled with some of the inherent tensions that exist in the ecosystem, including the value proposition of higher education, the need to be responsive to local workforce and education needs, the perceived misalignment of education and workforce programs, ensuring that there's an equitable approach that avoids leaving out and/or tracking students into certain pathways, and being responsive to a rapidly evolving workforce. We also changed our discussion structure. We relied heavily on the Note app tool at first, which was really useful for collecting initial brainstorming and feedback, but really limited the ability to have synchronous dialogue. So based upon feedback that we received from members, the team pivoted to a more discussion-based approach, which resulted in dynamic and rich content for the second meeting. At our second meeting, Michael Vente from the department spoke to us about the post-secondary data partnership and our current data infrastructure within the state. The post-secondary data partnership empowers institutions with more comprehensive data, easier analysis, and better visual representations to help everyone understand, improve, and communicate student momentum, outcomes, and equity. Fundamentally, the working group emphasized that the goal of higher education and workforce must focus on 3 things. The first, better serve the full spectrum of Colorado's students and learners through the variety of post-secondary functions. 2, improve the value proposition of post-secondary education. And finally, 3, to provide better data and analytics across systems to allow for more robust and informed decision-making at the individual and system levels. Based on our work done thus far, I am positioned to share the initial set of overarching recommendations submitted to you, I guess, tomorrow. Leveraging their broad and deep expertise, the Student Success Group has already submitted about 43 recommendations across a wide range of themes. There were several recommendations to blur the lines between K-12, higher education, and the workforce to optimize success. Building off the post-secondary data partnership conversation, a number of recommendations from our group propose utilizing real-time data across systems to learn how to better intervene and support students. And finally, we had several members submit the proposal of learner and employer records that are held by the individual and that provide transparency and transferability of skills acquired in post-secondary education and the workforce. I kindly and respectfully ask all task force members to carefully review these ideas and particularly to consult with your own constituencies to ensure that we have a truly statewide process over the coming months. I am happy to answer any questions from the group and welcome any other members of the Student Success Working Group to add anything else or jump in.
Kristen, go ahead.
Thanks, Marie. That was fantastic. Just a quick question. In the process of your deliberations, and I appreciate you saying it really was a two-stage process, did you develop guiding principles that kind of organized how you thought about the recommendations, ones that might be, for instance, carry over to the other task force or that we can bear in mind?
So I think probably Sarah and Barrett could elaborate a little more. But as I mentioned in that first meeting, we relied really heavily on that note app tool. So they or somebody had put together for us some overarching principles that we started attaching our notes to. So what are if you were able to redesign outcome data for higher education that told us that we were successful in Colorado, what would it be? How is it that we address all learners, the 18-year-old, the 35-year-old, the 50-year-old, right? So we had different categories where we were able to kind of organize our notes, but I think Sarah or Barrett could probably tell you a little bit more about that.
Kristen, it's a great question. So I'll give you the quick answer and then I'll give you a slightly longer one. Thank you, Dr. DeSanctis, for your summary and your answer as well. The quick answer is no, we did not develop very specific guidelines that are going to carry through the whole process. We did start each work group with a conversation around themes and outcomes that we imagine can help shape, and we'll go back to and review. And we did ask people we'll get to this later in the conversation, they work through the recommendations to specifically think about the theme or the outcome their recommendation was meant to solve. The other thing that we'll get back to later, Kristen, and in part because we really want to rely on this group, the task force, to provide some input, we didn't use it yet. We created a preliminary rubric or lenses or criteria that we're asking people to ponder and consider, both as they were developing their criteria, and it will be the basis of the conversation for the alignment committee. And then finally, within each matrix line or recommendation line, we do ask people to consider any specific principles or criteria to keep task force members at the right level, so they're not so far down in the weeds and trying to implement something, but what are the guidelines and principles that you would like policymakers to keep in mind as if they were to implement this. And so we don't quite get to what you're asking, but I think it comes into play in various forms. And I think as we go through today, we'll be able to touch back on whether or not we've hit the right cross section of that, or if there's something missing. And if there is, we really welcome your input. Thank you, Kristen.
I think that's right. And the only thing I would just layer on it, and we ask the groups in every discussion, and we're going to ask all of you as we go forward, is that every single idea and recommendations needs to be taken through a student-focused lens and really stepping outside any historic orthodoxy or way of things and put a student's first and outcomes as our primary guides.
Thanks, Sarah and Barrett. Any other questions for Dr. DeSanctis? And we'll give you another chance too here in a minute to think about these in context with the second group as well. Okay, well with that, I'd like to ask Helen Hayes to join us and share some of her perspectives on our workforce development group and summarize that for the team.
Thank you, Brian and Dr. DeSanctis, and good afternoon, everyone. I'm Helen Young Hayes, and I'm the founder and CEO of Activate Work. I'm also a very honored member of the Workforce Development Working Group. Our working group has also completed 2 meetings. During our first meeting, we discussed the Big Blur, which is a report from Jobs for the Future, also known as JFF. The report proposes a massive restructuring of education for grades 11 through 14 by erasing the somewhat arbitrary dividing line between high school and college in order to open opportunities for the learners that our current systems are leaving behind. It makes the case for an entirely new type of institution, neither high school nor college, that is designed specifically to better meet the needs of young people after 10th grade and to help prepare them to succeed in the world of work. At our second meeting, we discussed stackable credentials, very hot topic now, with the help of Scott Cheney from Credential Engine. The Credential Engine offers public access to a comprehensive, linked, open data database about credentials, competencies, quality indicators, and also career pathways. When built out in a comprehensive way, a tool like this can enable both learners as well as policymakers, so learners, workers, policymakers, and staff, to explore real-time information about credentials and about the value of these credentials, both in the marketplace and the educational career pathway. Several themes and tensions that we discussed in the committee. As we were discussing ideal outcomes and the end state that we envisioned for Colorado's learners and workers, and how we best as a state could achieve these outcomes, we did identify a number of themes that focus on 4 key objectives. Our first objective is to be student-focused. And by that we mean to improve the agency of all individuals as learners, without so tight a focus on specific places, programs, or products. So being student-focused. The second is alignment, really to improve the alignment and the marriage of education and the workforce of tomorrow with much more connected employment, income, and learning opportunities, while maintaining a strong focus on equity and inclusion. Third, we identified barriers that we would like to make sure that we can overcome. And these barriers include social, geographic, economic, and cultural barriers, again, with a focus on underrepresented communities. We also identified as an objective a skills-based focus to encourage adaptive learners with those critical thinking, communications, and leadership skills, in addition to technical and educational skills, in order to better collaborate across specialties, across cultures, to meet the needs of the modern economy. Since our last meeting, our members were invited to develop and submit their own recommendations for further consideration by the committee. And in fact, many of our members took the extra time to brainstorm and explore ideas with their own colleagues and thought partners before submitting their ideas. Our working group has not yet discussed what was submitted, but here is a quick overview. To date, the group has submitted approximately 40 recommendations across a wide range of themes. But the high-level themes articulated in those recommendations really center around the following. 1, creation of new grant initiatives. By this, we're looking at strategic deployment of these one-time ARP dollars to coherently align both workforce and higher education systems and structures through innovative regional workforce-driven partnerships that rely on proven models for success with demonstrable return on investment. Second, we are really focusing around the development of stackable and aligned credentials, again, marrying workforce needs as well as education and alternative training pathways. And so, a lot of focus on developing statewide acceleration and expansion of stackable credentials, multiple pathways for credential attainment, and more focus on work-based learning opportunities that are really aligned with high-wage, high-demand workforce needs. And thirdly, we had many recommendations focused on investment in data infrastructure, both investment in and expansion of robust and accessible data analytics systems that span both education and workforce systems, similar to Dr. DeSanctis's comments, and the need for transparent, portable learner and employment records. Throughout the process, members of the subcommittee have really balanced and grappled with and acknowledged that there's several tensions that exist in the space. One of the tensions is that we recognize that there are perennial tensions between education and training, between job and career, between education for life, versus education for now. And we talked about taking neither an either or approach, but really blending the definitions, again, with the focus on outcomes. We discussed the importance of listening to industry in order to meet businesses' demands, both for talent quantity as well as for talent quality, especially in high value and demand industries, in order to improve the economic resilience of our state. Members wanted to ensure that recommendations not only address equity in the ecosystem, but that we are also proactively addressing any unintended consequences. For example, exacerbating the phenomena or the perception of tracking students into pathways that appear of lesser value than a traditional four-year degree, or said differently, tracking other people's kids into credentials rather than ensuring that all kids have the skills, competencies, and knowledge to pursue whatever pathway they want. Furthermore, members are conscious of not creating additional barriers that disproportionately affect low-income and students of color. Lastly, our team is aware of the need to address ownership of learning and academic curriculum, of the role of faculty versus the role of industry partners, including the industry control and influence over curriculum and instruction. Well, as in line with what Dr. DeSanctis recommended, our working group also asked that all task force members review these ideas, contribute your thoughts, consult with your own constituencies and colleagues in order to ensure that we have a real, true statewide process over the upcoming months. And now I am happy to answer any questions from the group, or defer them to Sarah or Barrick if I can't answer them.
Thank you, Helen. Questions here for Helen or Dr. DeSantis?
And I would also suggest, instead of just questions, some of you who are on the task force are on the alignment committee, so you have not actually had any of your meetings yet. So you may have broader questions. And then number two, they don't just have to be questions. Please also consider if there's ideas or thoughts you want either Helen or Dr. DeSanctis to bring back, or Barrick and I to bring back to the committees to share some of your questions or concerns or thoughts or perspectives. So please make sure, feel comfortable. It's a two-way conversation and a dialogue. It's not just Q&A.
So I had a quick question, and it's sort of around the idea of a new form of institution, this sort of 10 through 14. Is the idea that would sort of be created out of the innovative partnerships grant process, where institutions would and schools would come together and with business come up with ideas, and that they would bridge that 10 to 12 gap? Or are you talking about real brick and mortar kinds of things?
Well, so we looked at that as an example of the ways to blur the hard distinctions between learners and certain sequences of learning. And so that may or may not be a recommendation of our task group. Not sure about that yet, but really what the point of that reading was really to think expansively about what are our definitions of the end game for specific learners, or I should say maybe upskillers and workers ultimately is the outcome of what we're all doing, but blending the definitions of where a beginning and an ending is, and then also looking at the ways that various systems overlap and should overlap more, both traditional education and training and development organizations. Sarah, did I answer that okay?
No, Helen, I think that was great. Thank you. And to her point, it was less of a recommendation and much more of a provocative thought piece to get people to embrace kind of broad thinking. And Helen, I think you did a great job describing the conversation on that. So
just to push it a little bit more, Sarah, is it conceivable that the concept could be achieved by the innovative partnership component among a collective of of K-12 and higher ed institutions?
I think once you see the recommendations tomorrow and the way we've categorized them, there's a handful of recommendations that address this conversation, this big blur. There's also a handful of recommendations, I think about 16, if I remember correctly, that focus on a new grant model. Now, there's 16 different versions of what that grant can do, but to your end, one could imagine if someone wanted to pursue a partnership like that under almost each of those scenarios, you could imagine someone submitting under that umbrella. Where, just to be careful though, since these are just recommendations and an inventory of ideas right now, we haven't actually finalized what the committee recommendations are. I just also want to be cautious of not having anyone feel like we're presuming an outcome. But yes, I think where you're headed is where lots of other people were headed to. Barrick, is that fair?
Absolutely. Yeah, I think a lot of this will become a lot more comprehensible when we look at that matrix or that spreadsheet we'll share. There's a lot of overlapping ideas and a lot of ways to skin those cats, and I think intersection and overlap.
Which maybe begs the question for those of you who are sitting there going, well, then why didn't you just share them for today's meeting? For a quick perspective, the deadline was Friday at 5. There's a couple stragglers that we knew asked permission to send them over the weekend. We had, in order to make the best use of your time, we had to organize them and get them out. And we thought it was really important that before we share them back to both committees, we wanted to get this group's insight and input on some of the next steps and process before we share them broadly. And then at our next time, after you've had a chance to digest them, we'll really dig into them. But having to present 96 recommendations in one meeting was going to make us land, and we'd be here till midnight. So we're framing the buffet table so that you guys can go back and take a look at it. So thanks.
Great point, Sarah. Other thoughts or comments from either work group members or others in the alignment work group across the board?
Do you have any, Kristen, to your point about criteria or principles, does anyone else have any concerns or thoughts that they want all of us to take back to the committee and think more about or grapple with? And if you don't have them now and they come up later, you can share them later as well.
I'll just chime in here. Scott Laban with Call to Succeeds. When Kristen elevated the question about principles, it immediately got me thinking about that might be a really nice entry point for us to kind of come together and identify some broad, high-level areas where we can align, where we can find some low-hanging fruit for common ground and overlap and interested areas to work together. I think if I'm worried about jumping right into tactics, and I'm fearful that recommendations in 90 however many could be overwhelming, but grouping in some form of a higher level principle that ultimately describes a value to the people who are the recipients of these recommendations could be really helpful. It's something that we do often with coalitions that we try to bring together, and I think they help create some guideposts.
Scott? We'll walk through some of the concepts and themes that Sarah mentioned earlier today that can serve in that capacity, and I think that'll allow folks to start to select where those common ground elements are. And we're certainly going to see those emerge over the next working groups as well.
Hi, Sarah and Barrick. This is Stephanie O'Malley from the University of Denver. And I appreciate the opportunity to listen in on both of these working groups. I did listen in on each of the meetings, and I just wanted to share that, as we move forward, a couple of the themes that were brought forth with regards to equity and diversity and inclusivity, tracking, social networking, I would say infrastructure, like when you start talking about technology, I think we really, really have to remain cognizant of how that plays out into different demographics of our community and our school community. Because, as we all know, those things don't always play out in an equitable fashion in each of the communities. So as we're making these recommendations, I just really want us to stay focused on how that plays out in reality, and are we willing to provide resources so that inequities become more equitable when we talk about these things.
Thanks,
And
Stephanie.
this is
Go ahead,
Norbert. This is Norbert. I just want to second that that thought, because you know, in higher ed, it's HSIs and other minority serving institutions are really only rewarded at the federal level through grants, but not really at the state level. And so it would be wonderful if we were able to focus on that, given the times we're in. Thank you.
Thank you. Other comments for the group here? I'm gonna make sure we really unearth anything that may not have been said in some of the other groups, or should be said here, certainly.
Hi, this is Nate Easley. I apologize for not being on screen. I'm driving, and I don't think that would work. So, but I didn't want to miss this meeting. I just got out of a board of trustees meeting, so that's why I'm in the car. So I just want to be clear, and that I'm glad to hear that we're going to be respectful of the difference between training and education. I think it's really important to respect both those realms in a way that celebrates them but doesn't conflate them. Getting a university education is different than being trained to do a trade. It could be that you could have a PhD and need to be trained if you want to make a change in your career. That's something we can respect. And also, especially for first generation low income students and students of color, it's really important to emphasize the benefits of going as far as you can in your education. And that doesn't negate training. So this isn't, it has to be this way or that way, but going as far as you can in your education, because there are a lot of jobs, and I have a lot of colleagues who were philosophy majors who have amazing jobs right now. And I say, well, did you go to the university in philosophy in order to become a project manager for this big firm? No, actually I didn't, but it taught me how to do certain things that are beneficial in this job. So I just want to make sure that as we make these recommendations, we respect both the need and importance of training and the need and importance of education.
Thank you, Nate. Drive safely there. Any other thoughts here before we move into our little more of the process discussion and give you some background on how we want to move ahead? Okay, so Sarah, I'm going to shift here and share my screen again. And we'll show our first round of our next steps here. You want to walk us through this?
Okay, so Barrick and I are going to tag team our way through this quick summary. We wanted to take you through some of the steps and give you a preview of what you'll be receiving and what members will be receiving over the next 24 hours. So as mentioned by both speakers, there are a total of 96 recommendations, separate recommendations submitted from workforce and student success work group members. There are a few, because several alignment committee members have been sitting in, there's a few alignment committee members that sent an idea. So I labeled them as such so that it was transparent about where they were coming from. If you're on the alignment committee and you see that, don't worry. When we start off the process with you guys, we're going to have you all take the opportunity to ask what's missing. Is there anything else we need to add? So, but we did transparently mark those, and you'll see that tomorrow when the list comes out. There's a lot of great creative thinking in this. Why don't we open up the matrix while I'm talking, Brian, and then that way we can start to give folks a sense of what tool we used. In order to create the ability to compare apples to apples and organize all this, we built out this matrix, and we asked members of each committee to send their ideas in, and they filled out what you'll see here are columns E through J. They filled out, which asked them, what's the outcome or end state that you're trying to solve for? What's the problem we're trying to solve for? We then asked them, what's the strategy or tool that you're considering utilizing? What's the actionable recommendation? Every time I say this actionable recommendation phrase, Barrick, I go back to our commission meeting with Commissioner Wilson, driving hard to make sure we didn't just end up with a lot of policy ideas and that we actually got to a point of something that was actionable. If you go over to the right, Kristen, you'll see that we had a column that asked people, if this is your idea or this is the lever you're talking about moving or changing, what are some of the principles and criterias or other note that you want policymakers and others to be aware of and think about? Then we asked people if, what are some of the barriers or obstacles to this or other factors that should be considered? And then finally, we asked everyone to explore, is there an existing example in the state or around the country that we should be mindful of? And Brian, we're going to hold off on the rest of the columns for now and just focus on this first section. So that was the assignment given. If you go all the way to the left, Brian, you'll see that the first couple columns, Barrick and I added in as we processed all these over the weekend. So they came in, the last ones came in yesterday. We had to get all this read, organized, and back out to everyone by tomorrow. So we, first we numbered every recommendation. So they're numbered 1 to 6 in column A. That will matter when we get to a survey later on. Number 2, we talk about what committee of origin it came from, just so that you all have a sense of which committee the ideas came from. There are a lot of ideas that overlap or are similar. We did not make any attempt at this point to consolidate ideas. So if someone sent the exact same idea in, well, actually, in one case, someone did send literally the exact same idea, and I did delete one. Some people took one of our sample ideas and they modified them and they changed some of the principles and criteria. We left those in intact. Then we created a new tab where, 2 new tabs where we tried to just create some organization and structure around this. So in the first, in column D was our first attempt. This column, the bucket or lever, or the theme of the recommendation. This is the case, Dr. Jordan, that in this first set of themes, you'll see that they're all in regards to blurring the line between K-12 and post-secondary. And so any idea that came under with that concept got that tag. If you go to the next tab, Brian, to the summary of tabs, Barrick, do you want to do the walkthrough on this? Not to put you on the spot, I'm happy to keep going, otherwise you can jump in.
No, quite all right.
Okay.
And what you'll see is that as these ideas originally came in, there was a pretty long list of categories when none of them were categorized to begin with. And so Sarah and I started off by what you're seeing in this bucket or lever column, starting with the blur of K-12 and post-secondary. There were a lot of ideas that we categorized into these different categories to make all of your task a little easier, and frankly, all of the committees going forward. We then did what you see over in the colored columns, where we kind of divided these further into tabs to aggregate them. Our commitment was that we weren't going to be the filter of any of these ideas. So when you do get these in the coming days, what you'll see is there's some that are close to being duplicates. There's some with a lot of overlap, or where people took a different approach to get at the same outcome. But we wanted to honor everybody's time and ideas by including all of them, at the same time make it a little simpler for all of you. So what you see is the numbers for some of these. For example, on one tab, when you get this, you'll see a lot of ideas around blurring this K-12 and post-secondary divide. And there were 13 different recommendations that we thought were there. There's a number, there's 10 around different aspects of data and data use, access, and ownership. Quite a few around new grants. And frankly, I think that's the one where people took the time to be the most specific. So you'll find a lot of detail when you dig into that. A lot of ideas, 23 around aligned pathways, a little over a dozen in structural. And then there was a category that Sarah and I just titled Wraparound Supports and Technical Assistance. So this is what you'll see when you get this. We took these 96 ideas, tried to first identify what the general category was, and then tried to collect these into some tabbed sheets within the workbook that'll make it a little more digestible for everybody as you go through.
I'm going to stop there for a second and just see if there's any quick questions, and then we're going to go a little bit more into some detail here before we move over to the back to the PowerPoint and the rest of the process. Are there any questions? And we can't see your hands, so you might have to flag for us or jump in. Okay, just really fast as you look at this.
Sarah,
on that,
this is Michelle Leek. Sorry, I was getting myself off of mute. What is the specific ask at this point as we're reviewing this? Like, what's going to be most helpful to the work moving forward?
So right now, this group doesn't have exact homework. We're going to have a discussion today. We're going to come to your specific homework at the end, but as we promised, we didn't want any of the groups to get too far ahead of this group, the umbrella group, the task force. So really today is a gut check on the process moving forward, the rubric lenses or criteria or factors we're asking our members to think about. So we'll have that discussion today. We will take that back and make any modifications before we send all these recommendations back to members. When we send them back to the members of the two work groups who produced them, so they can see what all their colleagues submitted, we're also going to share them with task force members and alignment committee members, just so that people can start to socialize. Those groups are not being asked to do anything and weigh in. And I'm going to come back to the next steps in a second. I want to point out a few more things on this this tab before we move back. Is that okay, Michelle? And then we will come back and answer your question more specifically. Wonderful. Thank you.
I just wanted to make sure I wasn't missing a homework assignment.
No, you are not missing anything. You're jumping,
Okay.
you're thinking ahead, which is wonderful. Look, there's 96 recommendations. There's a lot to digest. I'm going to warn people, this is not something you're going to want to print out and try to work off paper. The only way to do this efficiently and effectively, we decided, we may have gotten it wrong, was to try to do it with some type of this workbook. So that's one factor to keep in mind. Number two, if you look at the tabs along the bottom, right now we're in the summary of tabs. You can go all the way to the left, the full list of all 96 recommendations, all on one page. We are going to have a survey that we're going to show you in a second. And the survey, to make it easier to digest and ask questions, we break them back into these tabs. So tab 1 contains the exact wording of recommendations that are on the full list. Tab 2 contains all the data recommendations. Some of you may get this, and as you go through it, you might say, why in the world did they put this recommendation in this bucket or this theme? Look, we may have gotten one wrong, and that very well could have happened. In some cases, members who submitted had multiple ideas in one line, and we just had to make a judgment call about where we were going to park it. I think the way you'll see as we move forward with the work, I think you'll see that whether it's in X bucket or Y bucket is in some way irrelevant, and it's not going to change your ability to either weigh in on it or for it to be considered. So I just don't want people to be distracted by a tool we built to help us process this conversation, rather than thinking that the tool itself is the outcome. Whatever we write as the final report, we will have more time to talk about and discuss what that's ultimately going to look like. So with that, we're going to come off this screen and I think go back to the PowerPoint for a second, Brian. So that's the matrix. That's the tool we used. The work groups, as we said, will get all this information tomorrow is our plan. And then after, how they're going to process it is they're going to get this information with a survey. So why don't we open up the survey next? Now, keep in mind, who wants to fill out a survey that is going to evaluate 96 different detailed line item things? So this survey is meant to be pretty, I think if you spend some real time with it, it will take you a while to work through it because there's a lot to digest. The survey itself is actually remarkably simple. It's only 7 questions. It's very simple. However, it will take you time to spend reading through the recommendations. We are asking members, we're going to give members basically from now or tomorrow when it comes out through Tuesday, because Monday's a holiday. Thank you, Brian. Your body language reminded me that we made that change. Barrett, do you want to walk through the questions a little bit so we do a little tag team and I don't talk so much here? You're on mute.
I'm happy to, Sarah. Thanks. And Brian, if we can just scroll down here, we tried to narrow this down to a half a dozen questions. And what you'll see is we did it by tab. And for example, here on the first tab, which is about blurring this K-12 line, we're going to ask you to pick 3 of the selections that you think have the greatest opportunity for long-term impact, both on student success and on workforce alignment. As you go down onto the next questions, you'll see similar. On tab 2, where it gets into data, all of these generally call for a comprehensive data solution. And what we'll ask you here is to score things on a simple 1 to 5 Likert scale of which ones you think this committee should take a real look at considering endorsing. Next one I'll cover on, then Sarah, I'm going to throw it back to you.
Really fast on that. Some of the way Barrick and I designed the questions was on the reference tab 2, that was an area where almost all of the recommendations that came in were very, very similar. So rather than asking you to pick of these 5 that are essentially more or less the same, which one do you like best? Because when the staff and the chairs work to consolidate this list from 96 down to a more manageable number, the question we're asking here is not which one do you like best, but how important is this in the overall schematic? And so we did try to put some thought into the type of question or format that we're using with what information is in the tab and how we grouped it. So Barrett, keep going.
Yeah, thanks. We've got another one again on tab 2, and as Sarah said, here we're asking for this Likert scale. Down onto tab 3, which talks about the credential library. We're going to ask you which ones you find most compelling. There were some that you saw in these earlier tabs where we think you can identify 3 of the ones that you think have the most opportunity for impact, or to identify which ones should be a priority. Here, because we don't want to try to, as Sarah said, there's 96 across a number of categories, some with some overlap. We want to hear which general concepts you find most compelling about the creation of a new credential library or the commitment to an existing national library. And I think we've got a similar theme on tab 4, which gets into grants. And this one in particular, because there were so many that went into such detail. We don't want you to feel compelled to say, yes, this is the one, or to vote or rank those. But really, which ones, the concepts do you find most compelling? And look back to the red recommendations in that column, not the number in the spreadsheet. So do you want to finish the last few tabs here?
Yes, absolutely. Sorry, I got stuck on mute. You'll see a similar format for the aligned path where in some cases there's so much dense material in these, and there's a lot of replication of thought, and people, everyone's used their strategy and tool and recommendation columns slightly differently. So again, we ask you to kind of come up a level and report back on some of the overall concepts that you want to make sure don't get lost in the shuffle. If you can go down to the structural tab, this is a case where, like the first question, there's a lot of really different ideas here, like fundamentally different ideas. And so this is a case where we say, okay, pick 3. Again, in each one of these tabs, we're not asking you to pick your favorite 3 overall. We're trying to group stuff and figure out where we should spend our time as we work to consolidate this list, which things should rise to the top, and maybe which things we spend less emphasis on and narrow in on in future meetings. So this is a pick 3, as is the next question. If you scroll down. And to point out, when we have the one-line summary here of recommendation 84, and it gives you a very brief summary, we're actually in the midst of, Chloe, thank you, is helping me literally spot check and write those over the course of the day. They're not verbatim from the master list, and they do not do the recommendation justice. It's just our attempt to make it easy for you to toggle back and forth between two documents. So we recommend you look over the recommendation in the master document. And then if you go to the last question, it's really just an opportunity to say, what are you concerned about, or what ideas do you have about process? Feel free to share those. Please also know you have Barrick and I's emails, you have the facilitator and other staff's emails. If you have thoughts, absolutely share those back with us. So this is the assignment we're giving, not to this task force. Now, some of you are on one of these committees. We're giving this survey to the Student Success Committee and the Workforce Committee. Why don't we go back to the PowerPoint, Brian? Okay. Once we get all that feedback and that good information, remember when we first talked about this, our initial sense is we were going to try to consolidate the list right away. What we recognized was there simply were just too many good ideas, and we did not feel like it was our place to jump that far ahead. Hence why we did the survey and this new step. Once we get all your feedback, we're going to do our very best. So where we might have 8 recommendations around data, we're going to get that down to perhaps 1 recommendation. Where we have 5 recommendations around learning and employment records, we're going to try to get that down to 1. We're still going to keep it pretty broad. We're not trying to narrow down so tight that we don't have the opportunity to talk about them, but we're going to try to, as I call it, a consolidated list of recommendations to eliminate substantive duplication. The goal is that we get that done as chairs and staff. We're going to take that responsibility in-house. We're going to create that and ideally get it back to you guys by the middle of October. Our next workforce meetings are at the end of October. So why don't we jump to the next slide, Brian? In those next 2 meetings for work group 1 and 2, or student success and workforce, the workforce committee, they will have the recommendations, the consolidated list in advance. We will also be giving them more detailed homework to prepare for that meeting that will come out mid-month. And those meetings take place, I believe, I'm going from memory, Brian, on October 21st and October 25th. The working group 1 is the 21st and work group 2 is the 25th. Okay. Then the full list goes to the alignment committee. Kristen and Scott, we've been trying to think ahead, whether you call them a rubric or principles or guidelines. We've been trying to foreshadow or forecast ahead what and how we might be thinking about these. So all of the entire consolidated recommendation list will come to the alignment committee. Brian, why don't we open back up our link there? Okay, and scroll over to the blue column, please. We included, you're gonna have to go back to the master tab because or the full list tab. Thanks. And I'm sorry, my dog's gonna go crazy here. If it gets worse, Barrick, you might have to jump in. This section is an attempt to create some lenses or criteria that we're going to ask the committee 3 to think about. We forecasted them ahead to both committees so they could start seeing the types of questions we were going to ask. So a question around, and this may change and evolve based on your feedback today, but something around the implementation timeline. Is it something that can be implemented on the short term, so less than 5 years, or long term, more than 10 years? Or somewhere in between? Is funding needed? And if so, what's the order of magnitude that's needed to really have an impact? So that's the column M. Next, we ask, and this is something that we know is a real priority of the governor's, as he said it in his talking points to all of us, how likely is this recommendation to attract or leverage outside money or dollars from business, from foundations, etc.? The next question or lens or criteria that we're looking at is what's the risk and what's the kind of risk reward ratio or scenario that we should be looking at. Then you move over to the next column. There's a question or some kind of lens around reach, to how broad is the reach or how extensive is the reach. So, you know, a grant that perhaps allows us to pilot certain endeavors is really different than something that mandates it across the whole state. We're not picking which approach anyone would take. We're just saying, let's talk about the reach and evaluate is it the right reach for the right strategy and outcome. Next, we have a question around equity, and it's really to ask, with this recommendation, is it likely, or to what degree can this idea address and in a meaningful way the persistent equity gaps that the state faces? And then finally, or not finally, but next, there's a question around how sustainable is this? Is this something that, can this idea be supported beyond a one-time kind of federal infusion of one-time money? Is it likely to create lots of local buy-in and create deep roots and deep reform? Or is it something that might be short-lived? The other factor that we're also really conscious of, because we have this one-time money, how do we think about a cliff when the money ends? And then finally, having a discussion around what implications are there for other systems or structures in the state. This is the preliminary attempt as just a starting venture that we wanted to get your feedback on today. This is what the third group will consider and talk about, and allow them to frame their questions. And then very quickly, Barrett, do you want to run through what we're going to have staff do on the combined? The next gray section, Brian, we're going to have staff do on the consolidated list before it goes to the attainment committee.
So we really didn't want the conversations in the working groups to get confined by, okay, how do we do this? We wanted to focus on what is the idea and what's the potential for impact. Once those have all gone through this process, staff is going to pick it up and take a look at what does it take to make this happen. Starting with, is there legislation required to do this? Is this about a CCHE policy change? Is there data and evidence that exists to support the effort or idea? We have a lot of data from a lot of sources, and we want to know if that already exists or if we need to look at a new source of collecting or just a new source of data analysis and parsing. They'll be doing a check, because there's a lot going on across the department already, of whether this is something that the department is already working on now, or is this something that they've tackled in the past and have some input, some ideas, and some experience with it. Then we'll take a look at to what degree are the Colorado public institutions implementing this in practice or in concept, because we know not all of these ideas are radically brand new. So there may be places where there's examples of this going on, and part of what department staff will be doing is identifying that. And then finally, looking at to what degree are Colorado's private sectors leaders already doing something like this outside of education, doing something like this in practice or concept, that we may be able to learn from them, either in the nuance of how to implement it or what they've learned from doing it. So this is part of this long continuum to get all of you a pretty comprehensive look at these ideas generated, what they are, what the different levels of support from this task force is, and what it would take to implement them, including everything from, is it a ledge change, is it a policy, and how everybody looks at this when it comes to everything from the risk to the reach to the sustainability of it.
And then why don't, Brian, we go back to this, the PowerPoint slide, we'll wrap up, and then the rest of today is really just a discussion on, Barrick and I and team put out a straw man to say, here's the concept for the next steps. We really welcome feedback. We'll take that to heart as we tighten things up and move ahead. So ultimately, all these recommendations will work their way through some type of rubric and lens process with alignment group 3 that will come back up to this task force. And Brian, you can take us to the next slide if you want. In terms of timeline, we'll have 2 meetings with the task force where we're going to have to, 1, grapple with what are we finally putting forward, and then 2, how are we capturing it in the written word and representing it on the page. Remember, this rubric is really, and this matrix is really meant to be an organizing tool as we process the information. It is not intended to be the report. And so with that, Brian, I don't know if you want to flag anything on this screen, and then we'll open it up to questions.
I would just remind folks, we do have a little bit of a gap here, and the main gap we have is your ability to really review before the next, including the 2 working group meetings. We've got until October 26th to review the ideas that we're going to share. So there's been a lot of interest and some commentary, and I'll make sure to get to the chats that have come through. But we want to make sure that you'll have time to review these ideas on your own, think about them, and use that survey to provide your input. So I know you're excited to see the ideas. I've seen several like that. We just want to reassure you, you'll have several, we'll have some this period here to review that, get your initial view, and then another chance to review those as we work towards producing that report, including 2 additional task force meetings to discuss these.
So Brian, why don't you go back to slide 2 and we can leave that on the screen for a little bit and open it up for questions.
Yeah, I've got a couple already in chat I want to make sure we get to here.
We would love questions and reactions. You all are leaders of tough decisions in your own world, so we'd love your feedback on how we're approaching this and questions you have about the process.
All right, so first up from Annie, will this be shared with the public next week? I'm not part of the task force, but been monitoring the work for the last couple of months.
So everything we produce and create is posted on the CCHE website. Maybe Brian or Kate or Ben or Chloe can cut and paste that back into the chat for people to access so they know how to get to it.
Yep.
Landon or whoever, I don't know who's next.
Yeah, quick question, and obviously I haven't seen the 96 items yet. One of the questions I have is there was the legislative scope that we were all provided with before that had, I think, like 7 or 8 different bullets on it. On there, a couple of the bullets, it's, it's review, role, and mission, and service area. So I'm wondering, it's possible all 3 of those are, there's some recommendations in that group of 96, but if not, how do you intend to incorporate the legislative scope items that perhaps don't show up as a recommendation on this list?
Yeah, Lynn, I think it's a good question, and I think, particularly I'll address the service areas and ask Sarah to jump in. We really are hoping that is what gets tackled in this 3rd working group around aligned systems. And looking first, we've asked everybody to look at this from a student outcomes and student success lens and a student-focused lens. So these ideas have been generated to date, have really been focused on what are the outcomes, the programs or the offerings we want for the students. And then we're going to be asking the Aligned Systems Working Group to look at what does the system need to look like to deliver on that. And we fully intend that part of that, I expect the service areas will come up. Sarah, anything you would add on the legislative charge and how we've divvied that up and where that fits with our process?
I just add a couple of things to that, Barrick. One is you're absolutely right in terms of how we're thinking about it and why we put it at the end. 2, there's the dynamic of the alignment committee asking, so if we want to get all these great ideas done, how do we align our systems? Someone in the alignment committee may also choose, when we open up with what's missing, I can also imagine someone might offer a recommendation that addresses those. Right now, there's not a lot in the 96 that specifically address service areas, but that isn't to say that there might not be as we move forward. I have no idea what people are going to submit. It's been the beauty of this process. And then on the broader point of why we set this up with the 3rd committee, covering that role and mission work at the end. For those of you who are not closely following CCHE meetings, which Landon, I know you are, and several on this call are, at our retreat, we spent 2 days with the entire commission and the advisory board and with staff and legislators talking about this process and how we thought we should design it. And one of the takeaways from that 2-day public process was to make sure to have that role and mission conversation at the back of this conversation, with the notion that there was some thought if we started there, it may stop us from kind of big thinking or other ideas. And so we moved it to the end of the process, and that was a collective decision. I just want people to understand that wasn't just something Barrick and I came up with on our own. It was in a public discourse over 2 days that I know, Landon, I think you were in and out of with in your advisory role. So anyway, thank you for the question.
Thanks, Sarah. I've got one on chat here and I got 2 hands up. So first on chat from Lee, quick clarifiers on the column is reach, people, geography, or amount of mandates, and sustainability. How do you rate an idea that doesn't need funding ongoing?
That is a great question, and exactly why we need to keep fine tuning these and evolving them. So Brian, I know you and Kate are taking notes on this. this blue section and these lenses are absolutely going to evolve based on feedback. In fact, we rewrote it several this morning. So perfect question. Thank you.
More to come on that short answer, Lee. We're going to try to continue to provide, see these little qualifier sections here, narrow the question, provide you some logical ways to rank and sort these a little bit so that it's clearer to people why that would fall under that answer. Thanks for the explanation. And then I had two hands up. I know Debbie, you were there. You want to go ahead?
Sure, thank you. Sarah, I like that you use the word rubric, and it seems like the blue section is sort of that rubric for how do we align the different recommendations. And I might follow up on that in terms of the principal conversation with Scott and Kristen as well. You know, equity is certainly a principle that's going to be in the rubric. We might think of adding a couple other areas, not to blow up the spreadsheet, but are sort of those higher level principles that kind of carry us through. I know from my conversations with my employers in preparation for the task force, most of it was around higher reaching principles as opposed to the tactics. And I suspect the folks on the task force that have more of the day-to-day responsibility with their institutions of higher education really understand the tactical. But I want to make sure we're also making sure those bigger picture principles are in place too, to make sure we're looking at higher ed in that 50-year lens. So I would love to help have more of those conversations. Maybe it's not in this group today, but to be able to think how we can brainstorm some more on those.
I think, you know, in our thought process, I think that second, can you go back, Brian, to the calendar view for me for a sec? Thank you. Our next task force meeting is after the third meeting and before the 3 alignment committee meetings. I think part of our conversation, we haven't finalized an agenda for that, but part of the concept I think will be some type of guiding principles and input. We're conscious of not making this like hard and fast, these are the themes or the outcomes of the principles, because when we only have 3 meetings, there's a lot we've got to do behind the scenes. But I think what we can plan to do, Debbie and Scott, is to use that meeting to start to create a lens or a principles conversation that you guys can weigh in on heavily. And if others have other views about how we use that time, we are still very much open to that as we have not finalized the agenda. But I think there's room and time to do that at that meeting.
Yeah, that would be great. I think that's a better use of what I can help bring to the table, and then the professionals can figure out tactically how to make that work within those principles. But would love to be a part of that conversation as well. Thank you.
Great. I had Jen had a hand up, and then Kristen.
Yeah, I guess I have 2 questions. One on process. So the email that we're going to get tomorrow is going to go to the 2 working groups that have already been meeting, so that folks who are in the 3rd working group aren't going to get to answer the survey on any of the 96 to start. Is that correct? But we will see, so I'm in the workforce subcommittee, I will see student success members weighing in on workforce recommendations that we'll be considering at our 3rd meeting, but won't be hearing anyone's opinions that are in the 3rd group. Is that right?
For those of you, I mean, we have task force members, so who are populating the 3 work groups, and then we have additional members that populate the 3 work groups. So not remembering exactly who's on which committee. Yeah. Yes, we did decide to consolidate the list so that workforce members can see student success and vice versa. When we get the information back, we can keep that in mind as we're trying to consolidate the list. I think I want to assure people, Jen, when we move from this inventory to the consolidated, it's almost what we said we were going to do in the very first, in the very beginning, was we're just going to get rid of stuff that is obviously a duplicate. So the workforce 3 people, yes, they're not going to fill out this initial survey. They're going to be going through and grappling with the consolidated list. And I would imagine the consolidated list, it's clearly not going to be 96, but it's also not going to be 5. Do you know what I mean? Like the goal is to not weed out prematurely. We really want to send as many of these kind of through the process So I would argue that the attainment committee will or not attainment, sorry, the alignment committee will absolutely have an opportunity to weigh in. It is likely not to be the same survey, and we will no longer be using this initial matrix. We'll have it, it'll be cleaned up and smaller and easier to manage. Does that help answer your concern?
It does. And I think the only other follow-up question I had is on the full matrix with the recommendation, where then there's that blue section, which I agree with others' points specifically on those high-level principles. I will just say that I think those high-level principle kind of framings could also be helpful tools for each of the subcommittees to have as we work through our final recommendations at meeting 3. I'm not sure if it's the same principles or if they're slightly different, but do think that that's a helpful tool to kind of do some value and balance conversations. And then on the gray portion on TDHE, so that we're not going to get, as we're subgroups or subcommittees are grappling with which recommendations to prioritize and put forward, we're not going to have access to this gray information on the 96 recommendations or the consolidated list before those decisions are made, right?
So a couple things in the timing, and some of this, to be clear, so no one thinks that we have all this like in our head from the beginning. A lot of what we're doing, like we didn't know if we were going to get 20 or 200 recommendations. So there's a little bit of iterative process going on here that we will admit we're kind of making it up as we go along with a kind of grand strategic view on this. Jen, I do think the 2 work groups, work group 1 and 2, one, to your first or to your second point, we included this evolving blue section. It's different today than it was the first time you saw it, in part because we're listening to you guys, in part because as we get more stuff, we're fine tuning our work as we build this plane, right? We included it so that, and we even say in the survey, even though you're not filling this out and we're not asking you to go through painstakingly fill out 96 and rate these, we included them on the sheet so that you are thinking through them yourselves as you're answering the survey questions. And we wanted to foreshadow and give you a sense of what other groups were going to be doing. As to the gray section and whether or not you'll have that, I really think we were able over the weekend and yesterday and this morning to consolidate the 96 down to 7 tabs. And they're a broad 7 tabs, but I think we can get to that consolidated list, like we say, by the middle of October. And because we're going to be moving simultaneously through this and working with the department, my hope is maybe not for all of them, it may be an evolving thing, but I think we'll have the gray section filled out on that consolidated list by the time we come back to that 3rd meeting. And keep in mind, when you get the list back, the consolidated list, it's going to come with, I don't know yet if it's another survey. I don't know if it's with an agenda and breakout groups about how we're thinking through a couple different homework assignments and workshop exercises to make that 3rd meeting really robust, to let you guys sink your teeth into stuff and grapple and work through stuff. Because of the limitations that the legislature gave us by way of time, it very well may be that each person is not going to singularly grapple with the entire table over each topic. But I think we can assure that a group of people will dig deep on some of the topics and report back and share some of their thoughts. Again, a long answer, but it was a lot of questions. Hopefully that helps address some of your thoughts. Barrick, I went on long there. I don't know if there's anything else you want to jump in with.
Nope, I'm good. I'm just looking for, and Jenna, appreciate the pushing on us and look for next questions. Kristen, you're coming off mute. Did you have something for us?
Yep.
Oh, I'll bring my hand back down.
No,
I just want to commend you. I think this is the way you've designed this with the worksheet and the rubric and the survey. It's a very inclusive process. And I appreciate the transparency and reporting back from the 2 work groups. So knowing that our next kind of big assignment besides contributing as a survey is our work together on the 26th to think about some of these overarching principles. I loved the governor's remarks. Have we been able to share a transcript of those? Does he have that? Is there a written kind of remarks that he has that I could look back at?
So we do have the video. We have the draft as the talking points as drafted, but they weren't exact as delivered, as some of you may remember. But why don't we figure out what we can share by written word? But in terms of the actual recording, we've already made that public, and it is in fact on that website that we asked Brian or Kate or Chloe to post.
That's wonderful. Thanks.
But regardless, we can pull out the themes and the broad strokes and share that back with people. The other thing I wanted to say too, is we, we're writing notes in real time and trying to turn things back, and we got a bunch of different staff taking notes. And when we came back from the first to the second workforce group, we had some strong feedback that the notes or the themes that we captured, someone felt really strongly didn't capture the full essence of the conversation. One of the things we're doing is having some kind of overlap in tools. And so if you go to column, if you scroll over to the left, Brian, and go over to column E, outcome and end state, we ask people, when you're coming up with your idea, think about the theme or the problem you're trying to address. We spent a whole meeting brainstorming those. Some of you liked what we came up with, some of you didn't. It gave people an opportunity in column E to go back through and put new words or their own words into the outcome or theme. So as we prepare to write a final report, we have the notes that were discussed in the meetings. We also have column E, which is another attempt where people were able to identify themes or challenges or problems that they wanted addressed. Or outcomes they wanted to work towards. And so we're going to have to morph all this into some kind of written package, which is not going to be an easy thing to do, but that will be the next step. Actually, Brian, can you now go to the PowerPoint slide again and go to the second slide if you could? One of the other questions that we're going to want the task force to really grapple with, and I think it may become more clear after we get through the next reviewing of the recommendations and get to the next meeting. But that question about discussing the breadth versus depth versus some type of dual approach to the final report, that's something that this group's going to need to help weigh in on and contemplate with us. Is this going to be, we're sending everything forward? And is everything that we're sending forward going to be discussed in the same level of detail? Or could, do some people imagine that there's a written report that highlights a handful of recommendations and we include an addendum that highlights remaining ones? There's a lot of different ways we can go with this. We don't know. We haven't decided because we need to get through this process. But that's one of the types of questions that we'll be grappling with at the next meeting.
I had something from Stephanie. Is there a reason why private institutions are not included in the inquiry as to what extent IHES higher ed are implementing the suggested practices and concepts?
No, actually, we actually just this morning added the business, and we can just say Colorado institutions. So we're more than happy to capture it all and ask people what their what the extent that it's being implemented. So we can make that change in column X, it looks like.
Yep.
Thanks.
I hope I haven't missed anybody. I don't see any hands up, any fresh chats. I think we're caught up. Yeah. So other comments, feedback on our approach here?
Brian, do you want to go back to the blue columns just so that people can have those on the screen as they're contemplating? And like we said, these have changed, Jen, from the first time we sent this out to everyone. How they go out tomorrow is probably going to look different than how we talked about them today, because there's already been some great feedback that we'll incorporate. And after they're out, because we're not giving anyone the homework assignment to fill those columns out, we're just using it to forecast what kinds of conversations we'll be having next. There's ample opportunity to continue to refine those. So please send feedback or suggestions or share the ideas now.
Sarah and Brian, this is Michelle. I just want to applaud the effort to wrangle 96 ideas and make them into something that we can imagine being a set of recommendations that hold together and are aligned around the initiative or the charge that we all have to do this work. And I really want to call out, I love the assignment of values around these things, because the trick of all of this, of course, is going to be in the priority setting, right? And distilling those 96. And I just, your fancy footwork over the weekend is noted and valued. So thank you.
It was a team effort. So thank you, Michelle. The whole team appreciates it. And Brian, just if all the people are thinking about questions, if you can go to the summary of tabs tab for me again. Michelle, it made me think about something, and it goes back to a question that Dr. Jordan asked and something I said earlier. You know, first of all, how we group stuff. I mean, when you get in there, you're like, what were they thinking at, you know, and it'll reflect that we did it at maybe 2 a.m. and we weren't thinking. So stuff is surely in the wrong bucket. But one of the things that was interesting, if you go to line 7, the new grants, there are cases where people talk about grant dollars that are in other buckets, which is why after multiple iterations of this, we ended up writing the word new on the beginning of this. You'll also recognize when you get into this whole new grant section, what is remarkable about this section is that these 15 grant ideas in many cases are trying to incent everything else in the 96. And so each one of those grant things could have been in any one of these other buckets, because the grants themselves were really some members attempt to drive or inspire this type of work to take shape. In other cases, people had views about how to inspire the work, maybe through a programmatic change, or maybe, Deb, to your point, they knew the principle and the concept they wanted. They didn't know exactly which implementation lever, so in this case, a grant to use, but they frame out the concept really clearly. And you see a lot of that in the aligned pathways conversation, especially in line 10 around stackable, transferable, aligned credential development and courses. That policy theme, it just rang so true throughout. So when you get this stuff, again, we're just trying to flag and showcase some of what you'll be seeing.
So Sarah, as I've listened to the conversation and I hear the ideas that are coming out, it strikes me that we would at our own peril, I think, ignore that some of the problems that we are trying to solve are the result of what I would call a mega governance structure that we developed as a state 150 years ago that puts K-12 in one pot and higher ed in another pot. And that structure is 250 years old in the country. And yet it's very real. I think we would be foolish to suggest that this group could go in and tackle that question head on. But I do think, particularly for the alignment group, how we deal with the issues that are real because of that, to solve some of these problems, needs to be part of the conversation.
And I think that's that's some of the questions that group's going to have to think about. And I think when you get the recommendations, Dr. Jordan, you'll see in lines 11 and 12 around structural. There are some recommendations that deal with the statewide ecosystem, the absence of a system. You'll see in line 3 with the blurred K-12, you see some structural K-12 dynamics there too. So some of the recommendations attempt to address the structural stuff you're pointing out, but there are some underlining big questions that I think you are absolutely right in, that we have to figure out the right guideposts to the conversation for the third group, kind of implications for the system. Barrick, you talked about that a little earlier. Maybe it's worth repeating, but this whole concept of what systemic changes or what structural changes do we need to kind of arrive at the steady state that many of these recommendations are envisioning or imagining?
Yeah, I think that's right. The aligned systems will, and then I think ultimately it'll be the task force that we really look to all of you to give us the input on if this is the end state, if these are the alterations to what is or the new things that we want, what does it mean for some of those fundamental structural shifts in how we approach post-secondary education, whether it's blowing up lines between things, blowing up what we have known, or really realigning things to a different vision for the future. We're not coming at this with any intention of undermining any particular thing, but we do hope that all of you will take this really to heart and say, if this is the end state, what would it look like to build the system right and the most efficient system to get there?
We had also had some questions as people were grappling with their recommendations. Some people said, are my recommendations only supposed to be about the one-time money? And we've been clear to say to people, send in your recommendations that you think we need to be considering as a state to hit the outcomes that we were asked to imagine in the 1330 process. The legislature gave us a very narrow amount of time. One of our main priorities is to think about the types of things one-time money could be used to help address, but that's not the only criteria. So some people did recommend things that were more programmatic and specific to institutions or entities or departments. And so there's a broad range of recommendations. You'll see Dr. Jordan, and we'll have to figure out how we address all that. I guess the last point that the legislators said when they spoke to us was also, it's also okay for us to come back with unfinished work or unfinished business from this process that may need some type of additional process moving forward. But Barrick and I felt pretty strongly that we needed an end date on this, and the goal is to not have it last forever. But we can acknowledge in a report where there's unfinished business that might need further exploration.
Right.
Landon, our secret goal was to be done around 2:30. Look what time it is.
That's Landon. Landon has to stay on till 3.
Just sit here.
Before we break, though, just to go back to one of the first questions after our two speakers spoke, now that you've heard all this, is there anything else you want us to bring back to the two work groups that you want us to be thinking about, you want members to be thinking about? Now's your chance.
Sarah, I wonder, do you think that the matrix as you've, or as the team has designed it, gets to where there's really tension in the higher ed system? And how are we thinking about sort of making recommendations around resolution, right? Like, there's a little bit of like rainbows, unicorns, and 96 recommendations. Where's the rub, and how do we as a commission address that?
So for those of you who are at CCHE meetings, you know I'm a believer of putting the third rail issues out on the table and naming them, and a little bit of a disruptor. So Michelle, I welcome that, and I think it's an important responsibility we have. It's one of the reasons that Barrick and I felt strongly when we came back with the themes. We specifically pushed the facilitators and staff to say, we need to capture the tensions just as much as the themes. That really matters to us. Now, the themes that come out in work group 3, which let's call it what it is. Work group 3 is there are more task force members, I think, on work group 3 than there are in the other two work groups. It also is slightly more, the membership probably skews slightly more traditional higher ed versus this broader post-secondary or workforce conversation. So to your question, Michelle, maybe why you're not seeing some of those tensions, and to Landon's point about service areas and role and mission, where things start to get really kind of tough, the people that participated and made the bulk of the recommendations to date are not coming to the table with that same lens. I think we're going to see more of that conversation in this last series of meetings. And it was one of the reasons why at the commission, when Barrick and I were talking to all of our colleagues and the advisory committee about this, we did make a decision to move that to the end so that it didn't become a conversation in the hypothetical. But some of those more traditional tensions about not enough money, too much money, too little, to this, role and mission, service areas, that it wasn't a debate in the abstract, that we couch those questions within the framework of, if we want to achieve these things that are students first and these outcomes, is this the best way to align it with the current amount of funding and levers we have in the system, or is it not? And I think that that's the heart of the tough stuff that's coming down at the end. And so maybe we save the best for last. But I would say to the group, I often use phrases like rainbows and unicorns, but to the credit of everyone who submitted, if you really read through the principles and the criteria and the notes and the barriers and obstacles, I do think people put a lot of good thought into pushing back on their own ideas and trying to push back on kind of just this glossy world of wouldn't it all be great if. And so I do want to make sure before we end today that we give credit to, and I think our spokespeople said this, I would argue that so many of the members went out and talked to their colleagues, and they shared their ideas, they pushed back on their ideas, and they talked to a lot of other people. So we have this process, but with each individual member, I think many of them have created their own mini processes. And so even the reach of 1330 and its concentric circles, I think has been pretty expansive. So I do hope we get to those tensions, if you will. Barrick?
Thank you. I appreciate the clarification, Sarah. And I look forward to the second week of November, because it sounds like we're going to get to all of them in one fell swoop.
All right. Any last thoughts here? It looks like we're going to live up to our promise of giving you a little bit of time back today, but we're certainly open to other feedback. If you're like me, you'll think of things tonight when you're just about to go to bed. You'll get that bright idea. So please remember to share those with us as we move ahead. Look for the homework coming tomorrow, and please take the time to really work through the directions. There will be some supports that we'll outline there if you do have any questions, and be able to reach out and get some assistance. But your feedback on this is so critical at this point to go from 90 plus recommendations and really understand where's your appetite, where do you think we can do the greatest good as a team. Barrick, Sarah, any final thoughts here as we wind up?
Just really fast, for those of you on the task force that are not on work group 1 and 2, you don't have homework. So I don't want you to hear that and be like, what am I doing? What am I reporting on? And then 2, this is to everyone, but specifically because they brought it up, Stephanie and Norbert, that equity lens and the criteria we have there. Eric and I were literally working on that again this morning. We don't like necessarily what we have still. So if you have a thought on some fine tuning on that, shoot it our way. I think most of you have our email addresses. And any of you who have any thoughts on those blue columns, there's a window this afternoon, this evening, that we can make some changes, and we will. If we don't make your change, it doesn't mean that we don't like it. We may just be trying to balance and grapple with other things, and know that we will make other changes to those criteria lenses before we actually start filling it out. But feel free to send stuff in tonight, because we might be able to get it in by tomorrow.
Thanks, everyone. Enjoy your afternoon. Appreciate all your support.
Landon, you're getting us a beer. 2:34, man. We're out.
All right. Thank you.
Thanks, guys.
I'll stay on, Ben, if others want to debrief. I think we lost him. You're on mute, but I think it's okay. We'll see you, Ben.
Bye-bye.